All right, we're live, and thank you for tuning in to another episode of the Jude 3 Project podcast. As always, I'm your host, Lisa Fields, the founder of the Jude 3 Project, and today I'm joined by a very special guest, Reverend Brandon Harris. Welcome, Brandon.
Glad to be here. Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you for joining me. I met Brandon years ago in Atlanta at the Academy of Preachers, which is a great experience for the both of us, and it really stretched me. And it's the reason why I even do Courageous Conversations. So that experience was definitely helpful to me, and it really stretched me. So I met Brandon there, and fast forward this past weekend, we met again at the Missio Alliance conference. And so reconnected there, and I was like, man, it'll be cool to really have you on the podcast to talk about some of the stuff we talked about this past weekend in DC. So welcome again, Brandon, and tell our viewers just a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, thank you again, Lisa. I'm glad to be here. A little bit about myself. I serve as the Protestant chaplain to the Law Center and main campus at Georgetown University. I'm one of 3 Protestant chaplains that we have on staff at the university. Originally from Rochester, New York, went to college at Lincoln University, Pennsylvania, where I studied political science and religion, and then went on to seminary at Candler School of Theology at Emory University, where I got my master's in divinity and certificates in Black church studies and Baptist studies.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So I think it's cool for you to give a little bit of background about your church experience too, because I think we have a similar background as far as being shaped by different denominations. So tell us where you started church-wise and where are you now?
I am a ecumenical mutt, is what my family calls me. So I was raised in the Church of God in Christ. So, you can't join in, you got to be born in. I was born in Kojic, but I was educated in Reformed and evangelical schools from 4th grade through 12th grade. So grew up with a foot in the Reformed and evangelical circles, along with my Kojic upbringing as a child. So it was a very kind of chaotic world. On one hand, folks are speaking in tongues. On the other hand, I'm reciting the Westminster Catechism. And it just became a really kind of crazy experience. Went on to college, where I had experiences where I interned at Alfred Street Baptist Church in Alexandria, Virginia. So gained experiences in the National Baptist Convention, preached and served at churches affiliated with the Methodist Church, United Methodist Church. Went on to a United Methodist Seminary, where I served as a fellow at a Presbyterian church, PCUSA, and was ordained and licensed as a Baptist in the Progressive National Baptist Convention and American Baptist Churches, USA, and Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, Georgia. So I've been all over the place, and it's had all of these backgrounds have had an influence on who I am, but ordained Baptist, but ecumenical mutt, as you say.
That's awesome. And I too can identify with just interacting in different denominations. So when we talked about that point, we clicked immediately because we understood each other in that regard. So you told me about Lincoln, something I didn't know about it being not only it being an HBCU, but it also was started by has a Reformed Presbyterian background. I think that's something many people don't know. Could you give us like a little bit of background about Lincoln?
Yeah, so I am a proud Lincoln alum. Lincoln was founded by the Presbytery of Chester. And so the Presbyterian Church came together because African Americans were not allowed to go to Princeton University to study to be ministers at that time. And so there was a young man, James Ralston Amos, who wanted to go on and become a minister and missionary in Liberia. So the Presbytery came together and said, well, we won't let you into Princeton. We'll start a new school for y'all. So in Lincoln's charter is that Lincoln would be a school that God would be glorified by Africa. And it was a heavily reformed Presbyterian school. It had its own Presbyterian church on campus where students served as ruling elders of this church. Graduates such as Langston Hughes, Nnamdi Azikiwe, Kwame Nkrumah, Thurgood Marshall were all undergraduates at Lincoln. But for the church, Lincoln has had a quiet but heavy influence. So Henry Mitchell, the Dean of Black Preaching, is one of our oldest living alums. Gayrod Wilmore is a graduate of Lincoln. Francis Grimke, who was a Presbyterian minister in D.C., in the 1800s, was a Lincoln graduate. So Lincoln has produced a number of ministers and scholars in the church. And at one point, the statistics were that 50% of all Black Presbyterian ministers came through Lincoln.
Oh, wow, that's amazing. That's definitely a little known fact.
Yeah.
So thank you for educating us on that. Today we want to talk about apologetics across denominational lines. Why do you think, Brandon, that's important?
We are living in an age where denominations are important, and I never want to negate the essentials of belonging to a denominational body. But with the rise of nuns, the rise of unchurched folks, the number of interfaith marriages, the number of in Christian body interdenominational marriages, it's important that we build bridges across our denominations to present a common front of what does it mean to be a Christian. So at my work at Georgetown, this is really kind of essential to what we do. We serve an ecumenical, multicultural, multi-ethnic student body who, when we gather for our Sunday night worship service, they're Presbyterian, they're Pentecostal, they're non-denominational, they're evangelical, they're Episcopalian, and somehow we have to come together and say, what's our core? What does it mean to be a Christian? What does it mean to be a Christian on this campus, in the 21st century, in this current political moment? Who are we called to be as the body of Christ? And if we're hung up on the fact that, well, you sprinkle and I dunk, while they are essential to the faith and essential to what we believe, what's the core narrative about baptism? And what does that mean? What's the core narrative about salvation, right? What is the core narrative of what it means to be disciples of Jesus Christ? And so I think it's important for us to focus on our essentials rather than majoring in the minors.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's so crucial as far as being in that kind of environment, and that's your environment is really the environment of the world. Yeah. And so when we kind of get stuck in our little bubble, we miss that there's so much going on in the culture outside of our denomination, outside of our church. Mm-hmm. So it's very important, if we're going to do apologetics, to understand that what has been the most challenging thing in that.
I would say the biggest challenge really is because we all have different views on what the essentials are at times, trying to clarify that voice. And so that takes work, that takes uncomfortable moments. I think a prime example, and I'll just use this, is we serve Holy Communion, the Holy Eucharist, the Lord's Supper, whatever you want to call it in your tradition, every week at our Sunday service. Well, if I'm up there presiding as a Baptist minister, I have particular views about what that means. But then the Methodist minister standing next to me has a completely different view of what that means for him. The Presbyterian minister, who's on my other side, she has a completely different view of what that means to her, right? And so here we are trying to gather around a common table, but our theology around the table is completely different. And so that can be a challenge. It's a good challenge, but sometimes that can kind of get in the way of how do we come around our essentials.
Mm-hmm. How do you think we have those conversations? What is a strategy that you would encourage our listeners to employ in those difficult situations?
Yeah, I think one of the things is being bold, but also being humble. So being bold and being humble go hand in hand, right? You have to be clear about, this is where I'm coming from. This is what, through my study of scripture and through church tradition and history, I've come to believe. But at the same time, to have the humility to understand, listen to what someone else is saying. There are gifts that can add to our particular bodies by learning about what a denomination uses. Prime example is when we have a student crisis sometimes, there may not be a theological resource in my own particular tradition that I can draw upon. But what I can draw upon is the Book of Common Prayer, right? And if I realize that it's part of a wider Christian tradition, I'm not focused on, well, this is the Episcopalians' prayer book, that belongs to just them, I can't use the prayers they use. Rather than focusing on, here's resources from the wider church tradition that can help us to make sense of our faith. And I think that takes a level of humility in doing that, and a sense of openness, and realizing that, yes, we draw certain lines and boundaries, but we should also allow ourselves to be permeable to learn and grow and understand from the broader church.
Mm-hmm. And I think that leads us to our next question, us understanding from the broader church, from people who've already been doing things in the church community. When we were in DC, we were talking about the new wave of church plants and sometimes the tension between church planting and the African American church that's already established. And you told me that it was interesting, you being at Ebenezer, which is a historic place because that's where MLK served, and you working in campus ministry there. When church plants would come into that environment, they would make statements like, well, you know, we're bringing the gospel to this neighborhood, and it's offensive to the Black churches that are already there, because it's like, what have we been doing? We haven't been doing gospel work this whole time, and how the language kind of is problematic and causes tension, and them not even coming to the churches that are already there to consult with them and see, you know, what work has already been taking place and how it causes attention in that work. Can you dive into that a little deeper?
Yeah, I think there are tensions, right, between new church plants, right, and historic churches, and they're both necessary, right? We need our historic congregations that have been anchoring us in the faith for ages. We also need newer congregations that are going to do the work in innovative ways that can't always be done by traditional churches. But one of the problems is that I think a lack of humility causes one to come into a place, say this particular neighborhood hasn't had the gospel. We're here to now plant this church because we're young and hip, and we've got this new lens on the gospel, right? That the church hasn't been doing. And I'm like, hold up, wait a minute. This church has been here for generations now, preaching and proclaiming the gospel. And one of the things I always encourage people to do, and I was taught this by one of my mentors at Ebenezer, Reverend Dr. Raphael Warnock, and by the Reverend Michael Wortham, who was our young adult pastor at Ebenezer, was always put your ear to the ground in a new ministry context. Walk the neighborhood. See where people hang out. See where the gospel is already at work. So part of being in campus ministry, there was, rather than me arriving and saying, this is how we're going to do campus ministry, this is how we're going to reach millennials, this is how we're going to reach students, is I needed to put my ear to the ground. I needed to see where was God at work. I needed to meet the pastors of the other churches in the neighborhood. Because it wasn't just about me and my particular congregation, but I was thinking at the same time, if we're attracting young adults, if we're attracting college students, we may not be the particular congregation that those students feel called to. But what's a church down the street that I can send them to if we are not the congregation that they feel called to? What other resources can I draw upon? So I think it requires a sense of history, right, and understanding, and the willingness to learn a community before we come in to say, I'm here to bring the gospel to you now. Because I spent 3 years in seminary, and I go to this conference, and I follow my favorite theologians, tweets, and I'm always, retweeting their statuses, and now I think I know it all. I'm here to bring Jesus to you. Jesus has been here, and the Holy Spirit has already been working. It's time for you to listen and see where you can join in the Spirit's movement in that community.
Yeah, because there was so much more and work that's been done before a new person steps into a community.
Oh yeah.
And sometimes the work isn't as obvious as we would hope. Because you have to spend time to discover the work that's been going on, to peel back the layers, and then you'll see, oh wow, they've been doing some great work. How has your interaction been sometimes with other denominations or other people that may be more extremely conservative? How has their view of where you go to school kind of maybe offended you, or you were like, man, you didn't take the time to get to know me in that context?
I think one of the challenges that we have, especially from very conservative sisters and brothers, is that they immediately see the school that you went to, right? So you went to a mainline seminary, right? Candler is part of Emory University. It's a United Methodist seminary. And so they immediately see your school and they're like, oh, you must be extremely theologically progressive. Or I'll meet folks who saw that I worked at particular congregations, and they're like, "Oh, you must be extremely theologically liberal," right? And so you get caught in this crossfire of folks who either think you're extremely liberal or extremely conservative because of your background. And I think rather than understanding the depth and breadth that can occur by attending a mainline seminary, I purposely chose, when I was graduating from college and looking for seminary, I wanted to be around those who I could learn from, who I agreed with, and those who I disagreed with. I wanted a seminary that was going to be broad, what I consider broad church, right? I wanted faculty who were theologically progressive, and I wanted faculty who were theologically conservative, so that I could be challenged and pushed and honed on what are my core, what's my essentials, what do I believe is the heart of the gospel. And I think we can learn from all of the edges of the church, right? I can listen to John Piper. I can listen to the Gospel Coalition, right? And I maintain a subscription to the Christian Century. And I read what Amy Butler is producing at Riverside Church. And I am studying the latest in womanist theology. And I'm also studying at the same time what's the latest coming out of Reformed Baptist context, right? Because it only enhances who we're called to be as the gospel. Because when a student is coming to me, or a parishioner is coming, and they're like, what's the heart of the gospel? I often find that the heart of the gospel is not at its fringes, but at its center.
Mm-hmm.
So,
how would you articulate the heart of the gospel to those who you interact with?
Yeah. So I am an old school Baptist, right? For me, the heart of the gospel is that we have been saved through Christ, and that salvation in Jesus Christ is both personal and social. We used to say at Ebenezer, that Ebenezer Baptist Church is an urban-based global ministry dedicated to individual growth and social transformation, that we've been saved by faith through grace in Christ. But that salvation doesn't mean that, all right, now my sins are just dealt with, but it's got a global and social context to it. That means the redemption of all of creation, right? So that means we need to be mindful of creation care. It means that the redemption of society. So that means we need to be pursuing social justice. It's no good if I've got a, vertical relationship with Christ and I don't have a horizontal one that transforms the world. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's so key in just being able to listen to all those voices, because you're going to encounter people that have certain belief systems, and they have legitimate reasons that they believe that. And if you dismiss it because it's not your belief system, then you're not going to get any progress in the conversation, and it's going to be a barrier. And people will know us by the way that we love each other. And if we're not loving each other, it's like sometimes I'm like, it's going to be Episcopalians in heaven. Like to certain, it's going to be Methodists in heaven. It's going to be Reformed people in heaven. It's going to be Kojic people in heaven.
Yeah.
So when you think about that, you're like, okay, you have to learn how to interact on earth just like you're going to interact in heaven. So I think people sometimes forget that. When we speak on the social justice piece, that's really important that it has really been pushed in the Black church. Social justice isn't something we can disconnect from because it affects us the most in this country. How do you think that we help when we're having conversations with more conservative white evangelicals, them to understand the plight of African Americans in this country, especially with all that's been going on? We just had a murder over the weekend by a 15-year-old boy that is extremely sad, and I'm still trying to process. How do we help our brothers and sisters that are white that don't understand?
Yeah. With my conservative evangelical white sisters and brothers, for me, the conversation has been, and I've often phrased it to them, what good is the gospel if it's not about the business of changing and transforming the world? What good is the gospel if you say you see me, but you don't care about what weighs me down. You don't care about food deserts in my community. What good is it for you to go do? I posted a controversial status once. I said, maybe we should stop these inner city mission trips if you don't actually care about the salvation of that community. If you can't speak up against the death of young African American women and men, then why are you going to preach the gospel in these communities? I can't preach the gospel to you if I don't care about you. And so that's been my conversation. I was on staff at a large evangelical Presbyterian church, the only brother on staff at that time, when Philando Castile and Alton Sterling were killed, right? That morning, I had to preach at an early morning communion service, and it's going through my head, what do I say to this congregation about where I am and where I'm at? But I think it was having to be honest and just say, as Christians, it is our gospel duty to care about our sister and brother. And we are lying and portraying the gospel. As First John reminds us, how can I say I love my sister or brother? How can I say I love God whom I have not seen if I can't love my sister or brother, right? And so I think we're portraying the gospel if you can't do that.
Yeah. And if you can't speak up, Philando Castile, Alton Sterling, Jordan Edwards, then I think it's something seriously wrong with how you view African Americans. We were talking at lunch with Dr. Esau McCauley and Natasha about at a restaurant that I think is amazing, Hen Quarter. If you're ever go there, that was amazing. But we were talking about the fact that sometimes when we're invited to a white evangelical context, they don't invite those who are actually African Americans that have the credentials as everyone else on the ticket. So we'll have like PhD, white, and then when it comes to African American, we have artists. Mm-hmm. And so it causes us to recycle this narrative that Blacks aren't academic, and I feel like that's extremely problematic. That we are only picked to speak when we're artists in some conservative evangelical spaces, but there's plenty of academics. So to have, a lot of PhDs that are white and then have an artist, sometimes it can be problematic to the narrative we're perpetuating to the culture. Would you agree with that assessment?
Oh, I would completely agree. And I think part of the problem is, right, they're not out there. Oh, they're out there. The question is, where are you looking? Because there are Black evangelical academics in white evangelical spaces who are there, who have PhDs, who have master's degrees, who have the background. But here's the other part that I challenge my white evangelical sisters and brothers in, is you've got to stop looking at the label of what seminary somebody went to think, so everybody's not going to go to Gordon Conwell or Trinity Evangelical. Somebody might have gone to Union Seminary in New York City. Somebody might have gone to Yale Div or Duke Div or any of these other mainline seminaries and might theologically identify as evangelical, but because they didn't go to your particular schools, right, and they might be ordained AME, or they might be National Baptist, they then don't even look at those circles. There are so many African Americans who have what I would say are kind of core evangelical doctrine and theology, who are Presbyterian USA, right? Who are like myself in the American Baptist churches, who are in white mainline denominational bodies, who, but on some core theological principles, would identify as evangelical. And so I think it's about broadening your horizons. And again, that humility piece, being able to listen to those who might travel outside of your circles.
Mm-hmm. I think that's very crucial. What are the books that have helped shape and develop you that you would want our listeners to read?
Yeah. The first immediately is Jesus and the Disinherited by Howard Thurman. That really, I led students through that this year, has been kind of central to my own study and growth. Uh, that's a good question, Lisa. I'm trying to think. I'm really, biographies are kind of what shape my thought, right? So the autobiography of Reverend E. Ransom, um, who was a social gospel AME preacher. Um, Trying to think. Those two really have kind of been kind of central, at least right now in this stage and phase. I read a lot of Tim Keller, uh, Teresa Fry Brown, who was my advisor in seminary. I can't just list one of her books, but all of her writing has kind of helped shape kind of who I am and encouraged me, right, to be someone who embraces having a foot in the evangelical world and having a foot in the mainline world. So those are some of the books that have influenced me.
Mm-hmm. That's what's up. How would people get in contact with you?
Yeah, you can get in contact with me via email at bh631@georgetown.edu, or via Facebook. It's simply Brandon Harris. And either way, that way would be great.
You know what we didn't touch on? What I think this is really cool and important for people to know. What was your major emphasis in seminary?
Yeah, so my work and research focuses on preaching to the Black middle class. My key kind of thesis is that preaching to the Black middle class is a unique study of history, that Black middle class congregations have their own history and practices and theology, and that trying to find a voice to the Black middle class experience is necessary. All of us didn't grow up in the hood, right? Some of us grew up wearing J. Crew and listening to Bach. And how do you preach to folks who know Tupac and Bach, right? Whose parents are professionals, and especially in dealing with young adult ministry in the Black middle class context. What does it mean to live with that double consciousness of Dubois? How do you live in a world that is both Black and white, and preach to their souls? So that's what most of my research is on.
Yeah, that's important to me because, that's at the heart of a lot of the work I do. And Marvin McMickle also, I'm sure that was a part of your research too, Dr. McMickle's book, Preaching to the Black Middle Class.
It was. And whenever I'm home in Rochester, New York, I try to stop by his office and pick his brain. So.
Yeah, he's a great guy. I think I want to ask one more question because I think it's important for people to understand. I say all the time when I go to in some circles that are white and I say what I'm doing, the first thing is said to me is, "Oh, wow, you're doing inner city ministry." And I'm like, no, not really. But sometimes, but it's not limited to that because I'm Black. And then what does inner city mean? I say this so many times. What is the inner city with gentrification? Mm-hmm. Like, what does that even mean? Does that mean we're doing, we're ministering at Soul Cycle or Trader Joe's? Because that's what U Street is starting to look like,
That is
in DC. So I mean, I don't know how we're going to redefine the inner city, redefine that in light of gentrification, but that's a whole nother, I could be on that for hours. Yeah. But you said something interesting to me when you're talking about curriculums and guides for African Americans. Like, there's not many out there because there's either ministry guides that are dedicated to inner city African Americans, quote unquote inner city African Americans, and then there's devoted to more white evangelicals. So there's not a ministry guide for or curriculum for Black middle class college students that fits their unique needs about struggling with identity. And also, you made an interesting comment about the Jamal thing that I want you to share if you don't mind.
Definitely. So like you said, either the materials, church-based materials for that Sunday school, discipleship, Christian formation, it's inner city ministry, or it's like these white evangelicals. But I always say, in the congregations that I've served, there are two two different types of Jamals. One of the, primary targets is, well, Jamal comes from, and I hate to stereotype, from a broken home, inner city, and our Sunday school curriculum is about this Jamal. But when my suburban high schoolers and college students in my congregational settings come to me, they're like, my name's Jamal. I live in suburban Virginia. I play field hockey on the weekends. And I'm trying to figure out what it means to be Black and Christian in these spaces, right? I'm trying to figure out, who am I as a human being, right? When I face microaggressions every day at school, come to church, I get picked on because, I may talk white, or quote unquote, or because I play lacrosse, or because I play soccer. So those are the contexts that I'm trying to address. How do we do Christian formation in a particularly Black middle-class environment, which is a unique sort of context? And Black middle-class congregations wouldn't go, we're a Black middle-class church, right? But you can identify them. You can tell, if half the membership is in Jack and Jill and the Lynx and the Boulay, right? How do you preach to these folks? How do you do Christian formation for these folks in a way that helps them to understand their day-to-day lives?
Yeah. And I think that's so crucial for people to understand that. People to understand just the variety of different, there's so many different types of African Americans.
Yeah, there's no one way.
Yeah. So you have to be flexible with how you do ministry and be able to know your context and figure out what the best ways to address that particular context. Well, thank you, Brandon. This has been a very rich time. Is there anything else you would like to leave with our listeners?
Well, I just thank you again, Lisa. I appreciate being on here. If anything, I would close with is, be open to whoever and wherever God places you, and to learn from the breadth of the Christian tradition. I think as we move into the future, as we try to do apologetics, particularly in Black context, we're going to have to work together. AME folks and Baptists and Kojic folks and Apostolics, we're going to have to find a way to come together to present the gospel to a generation that doesn't care what background you're from. They just want to know who Jesus is. So,
awesome. Well, thank you for tuning in to another episode of the Jude 3 Project podcast.